Hello, and thank you again for coming along to Eco Views and News. This evening we want to look a bit at the past. Paleoclimatology, that is the history of climate before there were written records, or not very good written records. And we're going to look at the question of what's called a dust spike. This has come up again and again in the anthropological literature, the historical literature, the archaeological literature, and the geologic literature. A spike is a momentary or uncharacteristic boom in a moment of sequence recorded chronologically. And that can be in several different kinds of records, but the ones that geologists use are largely sedimentary records. And we're going to look a little bit at that today. What is a dust spike? And who cares? We're actually going to look at both of those questions. What is one? And beyond what it is, who cares? Should we care? Is it a matter of any interest of us today, even if dust spikes occurred in the sedimentary record in the past? Well, we're going to look at them because of what they indicate about abrupt climate change in the past. The more we're looking and learning about the geologic record and the archaeological record, we're beginning to realize that there were moments of very abrupt climate change that occurred in the past. And that's very important for us to understand what kind of patterns we're involved in today. So, abrupt climate change in the past is what's going to be answered by this dust spike question. And we want to look at it in reference to what we've been talking about over the last several weeks. As you recall, we talked about the global circulation of heat and salt in the oceans. The thermohaline circulation pattern, particularly in the North Atlantic, is one that Al Gore drew attention to in his Hedge film, and others have pointed out since that there was a pattern of the northward movement of the Gulf Stream, which when it cooled, having evaporated a lot of its water and being laden with salt, then cooling, sank and drew down with it a lot of water and flowed back towards the equator in a circulating pattern. At the end of the last ice age, there was a huge lake that built up, and at one point there was a break in the ice dam that was holding that fresh water back, and it flooded into the North Atlantic in a very short period of time. Hundreds of millions of gallons just released in a big flood. And in effect what happened was that interrupted the flow of this thermohaline circulation pattern. That's the current theory. And for a while, during the end of the last ice age, there was a kind of hiccup, a mini ice age that re-emerged itself in what's called the Younger Dryas period. And that, in effect, was one of the things that led to a refreezing at about 12,000 BP, or before the present 10,000 BC. And it's those kind of tipping points in the Earth's climate history that we've been looking at. Most recently, I referred to them, and you've looked at it if you've been following the series, because of the way this complicated thermohaline circulation system is now being monitored for what's happening in Greenland up here. Greenland is not an ice dam, nor is there an ice dam in North America. Nothing repeats itself here exactly. However, there's a lot of fresh water coming off of the Greenland ice cap as it's melting because of the warming conditions in the atmosphere in general and in the northern oceans. Now that's leading some people to be nervous. Why? Well, because there's a puddle of fresh water that's coming out over the salt water in the North Atlantic and has the potential to slow down or maybe even redirect the thrust or the velocity or the direction of these red arrows here, these northward moving Gulf Stream, we used to call them, but the northward moving portion of the thermohaline circulation system. If those are thrust straight east and they hit, say, Spain here, or Portugal, Spain, southern France, and the air that comes across remains hot because of the heating over those thermal currents in the surface of the ocean, then we could see a very abrupt change to climate occurring both in southern Europe and in northern Africa. So this is what's been the background to some anxiety about the emergence of this freshwater puddle in the North Atlantic and its potential to disrupt the thermohaline circulation system in the North Atlantic. Now, one of the reasons why that is of some concern to geologists is the way the Sahara itself has developed over time. The Sahara is the largest and the driest and the most extensive desert on the Earth's surface, but it hasn't always been quite this desperate in its aridity. It's true that if you try to drive across it any time recently, you didn't get very far in most cases unless you had special vehicles and a lot of fuel and a lot of water to maintain yourself. But the effort to try to map the Sahara in a modern phase has really been confined to the motor vehicle that's been well equipped. Back in the 1930s, a Hungarian soldier tried it initially, and there was an effort in the Nature Channel, actually it's the Green Channel, to depict some of this in a program they called A Fearless Planet, the Sahara Desert, and they dealt with this one Hungarian who went out and started making measurements and drawing maps of the central part of the Sahara back in the 1930s. He started in 1933, and he came across some amazing things, including caves, upon the walls of which were amazing paintings. Now, they're amazing not only because they're great and creative, but they're also depicting things that we didn't think would ever have been existing in that part of the Sahara. But large mammals seem to have been in juxtaposition with humans. Now, you could argue, well, maybe the humans walked 1,000 miles out in the middle of nowhere and painted these things on the walls, but it seems rather improbable. And it seems more likely that these, in fact, were present two local hunter-gatherer populations, which are depicted on the wall paintings as hunting these various animals. And in fact, some very interesting depictions of humans in interesting positions, which suggest swimming. Swimming in the midst of the Sahara. Now, this doesn't seem very logical, but if you look at it more in detail and date these settlements and the paintings that they are accompanying them, you realize that the Sahara probably had a lot of water in it in a relatively recent time. By relatively recent, I mean since the last big glaciation. That is, the Ice Age we were talking about on the other side of the Atlantic. Since that started melting about 12,000 years ago, and about 10,000 years ago it was pretty much gone. But basically, the dating of the settlements are about 6,000 BC, and 6,000 to 4,000. And what's now apparent is that there well could have been human settlements in this area of hunter-gatherers clustered around riverain focus of game, but that they were probably overtaken by a series of dust storms. And this is what we want to focus on a bit today. Dust storms we're familiar with in the modern era can come in very quickly, in a matter of hours, cover whole areas, and deposit dust in a very big way in any sediment or any Earth's surface. Certainly in lakes it becomes sediment, and it's from that we see a spike in the presence of dust in the sedimentary cores of lakes or of ancient lakes. You can actually take cores out of previous lakes and see when there were dust storms. Well, this is what is being called upon now by geologists as an urgent research task for looking at this whole part of the Sahara Desert. Now, you could recognize what's going on here. This is the Sahara coming up to what we call Egypt nowadays, and Sudan. This is the Nile River snaking its way to the north. And up here you can barely see it because it's so dark. This is dark green. This is the Nile River Delta out through Alexandria, Egypt now. And that's all green, as is the area right around the river. But as recently as 6,000 years ago, it seems that there may have been, or 6,000 BC, which would be 8,000 years ago, there may have been human settlements in these parts of the Sahara. As that becomes more and more arid, it's desiccated, those populations, the theory goes, are forced to move towards the rivers. And that's what this Hungarian started to speculate about. Let's take a look for a bit at, if we can find it, the sequence that deals with this a bit was recorded in this program, and I'm going to try to play a segment of it for us here so we can see what's at stake. It's really quite a dramatic change in a very short period of time. In fact, it's argued by the documentarians who put this together that this was in effect within a human lifetime. This is not something that happened over thousands of years, although there may have been a trend towards it over thousands of years. It's not something that necessarily took hundreds of years to express itself. It could have happened in the lifetime of an individual. Let's take a look.
Over 70 years ago, the first great explorer of the industrial age came out here in a regular road car. Hungarian soldier and adventurer Laszlo Almásy came to make the first maps of the Sahara. With only the sun to navigate by and no roads, he ventured into places that no ordinary person would ever find. And in October 1933, he uncovered one of the most remarkable secrets that the desert holds. Even today, very few people have seen this place. Matt has followed Laszlo Almásy's 70-year-old maps all the way here. This is the Gilf Kebir. Today, it is the driest place on Earth. There are no wells or water sources for 200 miles in any direction, and it only rains once every 20 years. The landscape here is so extreme that it is the closest environment on Earth to the surface of Mars. Deep within it, the cave walls show signs of the last thing you would expect to find in the middle of a desert. A thriving civilization. But even more remarkably, hundreds of miles from the nearest water, these desert dwellers are doing something unthinkable. They are swimming.
It's one of the most incredible things I've ever seen. You know, to see paintings of people swimming in a lake in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and paintings that date back to 1,000 years. It's amazing considering there's nothing out that way for hundreds of miles, and even the Bedouin don't come here. It's too dry. Nothing can survive here. So it really must mean there was water here once, because this is a dry riverbed.
"12,000 years ago, this was a very different world. The walls of the cave show it supported a subtropical paradise, where people hunted deer, hippos, and elephants. With a plentiful supply of food, thousands of hunter-gatherers flocked to live in this lush savanna. And it wasn't just here. Evidence from radar images taken by the space shuttle show that buried beneath the sand, networks of rivers once spanned the whole Sahara. North Africa was alive with people. So where did this other green world come from? The answer lies way beyond the Sahara. The Earth's orbit is not stable. Over hundreds of thousands of years, tiny eccentricities in its path caused the planet to wobble on its axis. 100,000 years ago, it tilted just 1 degree. But
Now, what he's talking about is the procession and recession of the ice ages, and what we know in the northern hemisphere is the emergence of ice ages and then their recession. And that's true, and it happens on this periodic basis. And when the ice age, in a sense, was in its full existence, the Sahara was quite wet, and these populations lived there. But all of this changed rather rapidly, about, according to him, about 5,000 years ago. In fact, it's a little more than that. It's about 6 to 8,000 years ago.
But it wasn't to last. 5,000 years ago, the Earth's axis shifted back again, with disastrous consequences for the Sahara. In the space of a single lifetime, the deadly sands returned.
Now, there's the assertion, within the space of a single lifetime, the deadly sands return. It's extraordinary. This is abrupt climate change on a scale we've never seen in recent years.
For the people that lived here, it was an apocalypse. Those that survived fled to the last remaining patch of green at the western end of the desert, the River Nile. This unique source of water supported a population of 1 million on its fertile banks. These people were the ancient Egyptians. Their great civilization is born from this cataclysmic shift in the global climate. The Sahara has played out one of the most dramatic shifts in climate change. It has altered the course of human history. But deeper in the Sahara's past, there have been far more dangerous and violent events.
Well, let's leave it there a sec. You get the point. It's pretty extraordinary that within one lifetime, a number of people, like hundreds of thousands of people, would have been forced into the riverine sections around the river. And basically, from there, they provide the labor force. And this is the extraordinary thing that's worth pursuing in terms of the history of this area. They provide the labor force for the emergence of a very powerful kingdom, obviously. This is something that is visible, in a sense, from space, but there weren't anybody around recording this. This was long before writing, in a sense. But what happens is that concentrated around this riverine system, people were coming into contact with the desert out here, but river agriculture right along here. And the river was bountiful right in the center. What happens was that a whole series of kingdoms emerged, controlling access to land along the river. Big kingdoms that actually floated blocks of building material onto lakes and carried them in such a way as to build these huge monumental structures we all know about. But what would lead to the subordination of a population that would willingly undertake the construction of those kinds of things? Well, you could say it has to do with the force of the kingship system itself, but it probably has as much to do with the subservience of the population moving into the area, wanting, in a sense, to make some kind of agreement to get access to arable land so they can live. This is a pretty extraordinary moment in human history. It's kind of the self-subordination of whole populations to other populations and the emergence of large kingship systems. Why did they fall? Well, according to some, they fell for the same reasons that they rose. In a sense, there's another big chapter of climate change that deserves some attention. Looking into this, Fakhri Hassan, the University of College London, has looked into the patterns of droughts that characterize these ancient civilizations in the Nile Valley. And he's come up with some very amazing evidence and theories about the successions of different kinds of dust spikes, you might call them. There's a dust spike here in particular that he's quite concerned about, and it corresponds to a desiccation of the lower Egyptian peninsula down around Alexandria that we talked about before. This is the alluvial fan of the Nile River coming down, where much of the agricultural activity of the ancient kingdoms was based, as well as today. And basically it dried out over time. Other archaeologists have noted this too, the concentration of populations along these narrow threads through the archaeological record, and ultimately their total desiccation. Apparently it's not just in this whole region, and that's something we want to look at in detail. Take a look, for example, at what seems to be happening around the eastern Mediterranean in general, not just in this Nile Valley area, but all throughout Cyprus, Turkey, what we call Lebanon nowadays. Let's take a look, because this is pretty staggering.
Two archaeologists in Egypt believe they have evidence that the sudden collapse of the Pyramid Age was due to a catastrophic drought. At the same moment in history, just 800 miles away, another ancient empire was in similar turmoil. The Akkadian Empire extended far across Mesopotamia, now part of Iraq and Syria. The agricultural capital was Leilan. The ancient city was surrounded by fertile tracts of land and boasted a population of 30,000, according to Yale University archaeologist Dr. Harvey Weiss.
When I first went to Leilan, I was terribly impressed by its physical size. This was really a very, very large city. The same way that Kansas City served as the hub which collected grain from the great grain belt of the United States, so Leilan served as a great collection point for northern Mesopotamian agricultural production.
But everywhere he dug in the once thriving metropolis, Weiss came upon the same mystery. A layer of windblown sand, similar to the one Hassan had found in the lake by the pyramids.
Windblown deposits of different sized grains. Sandy deposit, very, 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 very fine. This deposit represents something on the order of 100 or 200 years of extremely different climatic conditions.
For over 100 years, there are no signs of human habitation or any life at all in the sediments.
There was, even within this dust, an absence of earthworm. And so this was becoming a very perplexing situation.
It seemed that very quickly, Leilan had turned from a bustling metropolis into a ghost town. The collapse of Leilan appeared to coincide with the fall of the entire Akkadian Empire. Weiss began to suspect the same culprit that Hassan blamed for the collapse of the Old Kingdom of Egypt.
We initially thought drought, arid event, aridification. And then we began to see that this was rather extensive, that it extended across regions. It extended into Turkey. It extended into Palestine. There was a drought period in Egypt. There was a similar abandonment collapse situation on the Greek mainland.
There's increasing evidence to suggest that the collapse of the Old Kingdom was not unique. Around 2200 BC, half a dozen highly advanced civilizations were simultaneously brought to their knees. Weiss suspected only one thing could have had such a widespread and profound effect: a catastrophic change in climate.
Okay, well, catastrophic change in climate. Now we'll actually take a look at that in future, because we want to look at the importance of this particular dig of his, Tel Elan. He's the professor who's uncovered this material, Professor Harvey Weiss, in this particular capital city, a layer of dust, a dust spike. It's confirmed by Peter Domenical at the Columbia University's labs, and Harvey Weiss has documented it perhaps more than anyone else. As he says from a phone call he received from Peter Domenical, you're not going to believe it, dust spike, 2200 BC. So we're going to be looking at that pattern in the future, particularly in reference to Cyprus as a laboratory and a vital indicator of climate change in the Mediterranean. What is a dust spike? Who cares? We care, because it has to do with abrupt climate change in the past.